city of several 100,000 people, temples piercing through the clouds, a king standing atop a pyramid, pulling a thorned cord through his own tongue, letting the blood drip onto bark paper as an offering to keep the sun rising, and then, within a few short decades, the entire city empty, abandoned, swallowed whole by jungle so thick that centuries later explorers would stumble upon stone temples poking through the canopy and have no idea an empire had ever stood there at all. The Maya never collapsed just once. They collapsed, rebuilt, and collapsed again, in cycles that stretched across nearly 1,500 years. How does a civilization that fed millions of people, that predicted solar eclipses with mathematical precision no European astronomer could match, that dominated Central America without any single unifying empire ever forcing it together, how does something like that simply dissolve, generations before a single Spanish soldier ever set foot on its shores? In 2018, a laser scanning technology called LiDAR flew over the dense jungle canopy of northern Guatemala. What it found underneath, invisible to the naked eye for centuries, was staggering. More than 60,000 structures, cities, roads and fortifications, revealing a Maya population that may have reached nearly 20 million people, not the 1 or 2 million scholars had assumed for decades. For years, historians described the Maya as a peaceful people obsessed with the stars. Deciphered inscriptions tell a very different story. Coordinated total war, timed deliberately to the movements of the planet Venus, unleashed to annihilate rival kingdoms down to their royal bloodlines. Nearly every great civilization in human history built itself along a major river, the Nile feeding Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates feeding Mesopotamia, the Indus feeding its own ancient cities. The Maya did something almost nobody else attempted. They built one of history's most sophisticated civilizations directly inside a tropical rainforest, a landscape that offered brutal humidity, thin and unforgiving soil, and no major rivers to speak of across huge stretches of their eventual territory. In the centuries before what archaeologists call the Classic period, small farming settlements began taking root across this difficult terrain, sustained above all by a single crop that came to occupy something close to sacred status in Maya belief: maize. Corn was not simply food. It became, in Maya cosmology, quite literally the substance from which human beings themselves were believed to have been created, a foundational relationship between crop and people that would shape religious belief for the next 2,000 years. Long before famous cities like Tikal ever rose to prominence, an earlier metropolis dominated the landscape, El Mirador, a city whose scale still stuns archaeologists today. At its heart stood La Danta, a pyramid complex so massive in total volume that, by some calculations, it actually exceeds the size of Egypt's Great Pyramid of Giza, an almost unbelievable engineering achievement, built entirely without metal tools, wheeled transport, or draft animals of any kind. During this same early period, the Maya developed something no other civilization in the Americas ever achieved: a fully developed system of hieroglyphic writing, capable of recording complex historical narratives, royal genealogies, and astronomical calculations with a level of linguistic sophistication that remained, for centuries following European contact, almost entirely undeciphered and misunderstood by outside scholars. Maya society organized itself around a rigid hierarchy with divine kings at its apex, rulers who were not merely political or military leaders, but were believed to serve as direct intermediaries between the human world and the realm of the gods, their authority resting as much on ritual and cosmic legitimacy as on military force or economic control. And then, around 150 AD, something happened that historians still cannot fully explain. El Mirador, this first great Maya metropolis, was abandoned. No definitive evidence of invasion, no clear single catastrophic event survives in the archaeological record. Simply a great city, quietly emptied, its monuments left to the encroaching forest. It was the very first hint of a pattern that would define Maya history for the next 1500 years. Extraordinary civilizational achievement, followed by sudden, poorly understood collapse. The scale of El Mirador's achievement deserves particular attention, since for decades archaeologists studying the more famous later cities like Tikal and Palenque had little idea that an even earlier civilization of comparable or greater sophistication had already risen and fallen centuries before those better-known sites reached their own peak of influence. Excavations at El Mirador have revealed evidence of a highly organized society capable of mobilizing enormous labor forces for monumental construction projects, alongside early examples of the same hieroglyphic writing system and religious iconography that would continue developing and evolving across the many centuries of Maya civilization that followed. This early flowering and subsequent mysterious abandonment established, right at the very beginning of documented Maya history, the essential rhythm of rise and fall that would repeat itself, with variations, again and again, across the following millennium and a half. The specific religious and political framework that positioned Maya kings as divine intermediaries deserves closer examination, since this particular arrangement of sacred kingship would prove both the source of extraordinary civilizational achievement and, eventually, a genuine structural vulnerability across Maya history. Unlike some ancient civilizations where religious and political authority remained at least partially separated between priestly and royal classes, Maya kingship fused these two categories of power almost completely, meaning that any crisis of royal legitimacy, whether from military defeat, failed harvests, or simple succession disputes, threatened not merely political stability, but the very cosmic order these rulers claimed to personally sustain through their ongoing ritual obligations. The specific role of maize within Maya religious cosmology deserves further examination, given how thoroughly this single crop shaped virtually every aspect of Maya cultural and spiritual life. Beyond simply serving as the primary staple food source sustaining Maya populations across the centuries, corn appears throughout Maya art and mythology as a central creative and generative symbol, with Maya kings themselves frequently depicted in ceremonial art, wearing elaborate headdresses evoking growing corn plants, visually reinforcing their claimed role as agents responsible for ensuring successful harvests through their ongoing ritual relationship with the gods. This deep cultural and religious association between kingship, agricultural fertility, and cosmic order helps explain precisely why the later agricultural failures associated with prolonged drought proved so devastating not merely to Maya food supplies, but to the very foundations of royal political legitimacy itself. To understand why Maya civilization functioned the way it did, one has to understand their vision of the universe itself, a cosmology built around a layered structure of 13 heavens stacked above the earth, and 9 terrifying levels of the underworld below, a dark realm known as Xibalba, ruled by death gods, whose mythology permeated nearly every aspect of Maya religious life. At the foundation of Maya religious belief sat a genuinely unsettling premise. The gods had created human beings from maize and blood, and in exchange for this act of creation, humanity owed the gods a continuous debt that could only be repaid through the offering of blood in return. Without this ongoing sacrifice, Maya belief held, the sun itself might fail to rise, and the entire cosmic order could collapse into chaos. This belief manifested most vividly in the practice of ritual bloodletting, a central and deeply personal religious obligation performed by kings and queens alike. Using thorned cords made from the maguey plant, rulers would pierce their own tongues or genitals, drawing blood that was then burned as a sacred offering, believed to open a portal, allowing communication directly with ancestors and gods, a practice recorded in vivid, unmistakable detail on temple lintels and painted ceramics throughout the Maya world. Beyond self-sacrifice, the Maya also practiced human sacrifice on captured enemies, a fate frequently reserved for defeated rival nobility and kings. Victims might have their hearts cut out atop temple platforms, or be cast into sacred sinkholes called cenotes, natural limestone pools believed to serve as direct portals into the underworld itself. Despite this reputation for ritual violence, Maya scholars achieved intellectual feats that remain genuinely staggering by any historical standard. Their calendar systems, particularly the interlocking Tzolk'in and Harb calendars, allowed astronomers to calculate the movements of celestial bodies and predict solar eclipses with remarkable precision, all without the benefit of telescopes or any of the optical technology later developed in Europe. Maya civilization also produced one of history's more brutal spectator sports, a ritual ball game known as Pok-to-Pok, played on stone courts found throughout the Maya world, in which teams competed to move a solid rubber ball using only their hips and torsos. In certain documented instances, the losing team, and in some interpretations potentially even the winning team, depending on the specific ritual context of the match, faced execution as a sacrificial offering following the conclusion of play. The physical courts where this ball game took place represented significant architectural investments in their own right. Elaborately constructed stone structures found at nearly every major Maya city, often positioned prominently near the most important temples and palaces, underscoring just how central this ritual sport was to Maya civic and religious life. Carved relief panels found at numerous ball court sites depict the game's outcomes in vivid, sometimes graphic detail, including scenes of decapitation directly connected to the sport's conclusion, imagery that leaves little doubt about the genuine life and death stakes that could accompany what might otherwise appear, on the surface, to be simply an athletic competition. Beyond its ritual significance, the game also served important diplomatic and political functions, with matches sometimes staged specifically to resolve or formalize disputes between rival cities. Blood and sport intertwined in ways that reflected the broader Maya worldview, linking violence, sacrifice, and cosmic order into a single unified system of belief. The Maya underworld of Xibalba, so central to their broader cosmological framework, receives extensive treatment in one of the few surviving pre-Columbian Maya texts to escape later colonial destruction, a document known as the Popol Vuh, preserved through later transcription among the Quiché Maya of highland Guatemala. This remarkable text describes a mythological narrative in which hero twins descend into the underworld to confront and ultimately defeat the death gods ruling over Xibalba, a foundational myth that scholars believe held deep resonance for how ordinary Maya people understood the relationship between death, rebirth, and the ongoing cosmic struggle their kings claimed to personally mediate on behalf of their entire community through ritual sacrifice and continuous religious observance. The Maya calendar system itself represented one of the ancient world's most genuinely sophisticated systems of timekeeping, combining multiple interlocking cycles that together created what scholars call the calendar round, a repeating 52-year cycle formed by the interaction between the 260-day Tzolk'in ritual calendar and the 365-day Harb solar calendar. Beyond this shorter cycle, Maya astronomers and mathematicians also developed the long count calendar system, capable of tracking dates across vast spans of time, extending thousands of years into both the past and future. Employing a sophisticated positional numbering system that included the independent invention of the mathematical concept of zero, a genuinely remarkable intellectual achievement that predates comparable developments in most other ancient mathematical traditions around the world by a considerable margin. In 378 AD, an event occurred that would permanently alter the trajectory of Maya political history, an episode historians and Maya inscriptions themselves refer to simply as the arrival of strangers. On this date, a mysterious military figure named Siaj Kak, whose name translates roughly to fire is born, appears suddenly in the historical record, arriving with forces connected to the distant and enormously powerful city of Teotihuacan, located near modern-day Mexico City, over 600 miles from the Maya heartland. On the very same day this foreign commander arrived, the reigning king of Tikal, one of the most important Maya cities of the era, died under circumstances the surviving inscriptions describe with an almost eerie, deliberate vagueness, a silence in the historical record that most scholars interpret as evidence of a coordinated, foreign-orchestrated political assassination rather than any natural or coincidental death. In the aftermath, a young boy connected to the Teotihuacan faction was installed as the new ruler of Tikal, a puppet regime change imposed through outside military intervention that fundamentally reshaped the balance of power across the entire Maya lowlands, introducing an entirely new political order backed by foreign force rather than traditional Maya dynastic succession. Alongside this political transformation came significant military innovation, the introduction of the atlatl, a spear-throwing weapon that dramatically increased the range and lethality of Maya warfare, along with broader tactical approaches to warfare that reflected the more centralized, imperial military traditions of Teotihuacan itself, a marked departure from the smaller-scale raiding conflicts that had characterized earlier Maya intercity rivalry. Bolstered by this foreign backing, superior weaponry, and newly imported political and military doctrine, Tikal rapidly transformed from merely one significant city among many into the single dominant power across the Maya lowlands, a position of supremacy that would define the region's politics for generations, until an equally ambitious rival eventually emerged to directly challenge that dominance. The city of Teotihuacan itself, whose distant intervention so thoroughly reshaped Tikal's political destiny, remains one of the great enigmas of ancient Mesoamerican history in its own right. At its height, this enormous urban center may have housed well over 100,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities anywhere on the planet during this particular era, and its influence extended across a vast trading and political network, stretching far beyond its immediate central Mexican homeland. The exact nature of the relationship between Teotihuacan and the Maya lowlands, whether representing direct military conquest, a more informal but still coercive sphere of political influence, or some combination of both approaches, applied differently across different regions and time periods, remains a subject of active scholarly debate even today, with each new archaeological discovery continuing to refine and complicate earlier, simpler interpretations of exactly how this distant central Mexican power came to exercise such profound and lasting influence over Maya political development. The broader pattern of foreign intervention reshaping local Maya political dynasties that Tikal experienced in 378 AD was not entirely unique, though it stands as by far the best documented and most historically consequential example scholars have identified within the surviving inscriptional record. Similar patterns of Teotihuacan-connected political interference appear, with varying degrees of certainty, at several other Maya sites during this same general period, suggesting that the distant central Mexican metropolis maintained an active, deliberate strategy of political influence extending across a considerable portion of the broader Maya world during this critical era, rather than the Tikal intervention representing some isolated, one-time event unconnected to any larger, more systematic pattern of long-distance political engagement. The archaeological evidence for direct Teotihuacan presence at Tikal extends well beyond the historical inscriptions describing Siaj Ka'ak's arrival, including distinctive architectural styles, imported ceramics, and burial practices reflecting central Mexican rather than traditional Maya customs found within Tikal's own archaeological deposits, dating to this critical period of transition. Perhaps most strikingly, archaeologists have identified a residential compound within Tikal itself, constructed in a style directly mirroring residential architecture found at Teotihuacan, complete with the distinctive talud tablero architectural technique characteristic of the distant central Mexican capital, suggesting that actual Teotihuacan-affiliated individuals, not merely Teotihuacan-influenced local elites, lived and maintained an ongoing physical presence within Tikal itself during this transformative period of foreign political intervention. The period historians call the Classic Maya era witnessed an extraordinary flourishing of city-states across the region, with more than 40 distinct political centers competing simultaneously for territory, trade routes, and prestige, none of them ever unified under a single overarching Maya empire in the way later Mesoamerican civilizations like the Aztecs would eventually organize their own territory. This fragmented political landscape bore genuine resemblance to ancient Greece's competing city-states, a world of rival capitals, shifting alliances, and periodic warfare, rather than any single centralized imperial authority governing the entire Maya world from one unchallenged capital. Into this competitive landscape rose a formidable rival to Tikal's dominance, the city of Calakmul, ruler of what inscriptions describe as the Snake Kingdom, a dynasty whose ambitions matched, and eventually threatened to surpass, Tikal's own accumulated power and prestige across the broader region. Rather than confronting Tikal through direct, immediate military conquest, Calakmul pursued a patient and remarkably sophisticated strategy of what modern historians might recognize as shadow governance, forging marriage alliances, cultivating smaller client states, and gradually encircling Tikal with a network of loyal or dependent allied cities, systematically isolating their great rival long before any decisive military confrontation actually took place. What followed was a conflict stretching across more than a century, a sustained rivalry historians have come to describe as something close to a Maya Cold War, one that repeatedly drew smaller cities throughout the region into proxy conflicts fought largely on behalf of these two great competing powers, rather than over their own independent territorial interests. Surviving inscriptions from this extended period of conflict describe brutal outcomes for the losing side in these confrontations, including the ritual beheading of defeated kings, evidence carved directly into stone monuments that reveals a level of calculated, sustained brutality in these proxy wars that stands in sharp contrast to the more peaceful, stargazing image of Maya civilization that dominated popular understanding for so much of the 20th century. The decipherment of Maya hieroglyphic writing during the latter half of the 20th century proved absolutely essential to uncovering this more complete and considerably more violent picture of classic period politics. For generations, scholars working before this decipherment breakthrough had genuinely believed, based largely on the peaceful astronomical and calendrical content that dominated more easily interpreted portions of the written record, that the Maya represented an unusually contemplative, non-violent civilization primarily focused on philosophy, mathematics, and stargazing rather than warfare and conquest. Once scholars finally cracked the phonetic and logographic structure of Maya writing in the 1960s through the 1980s, an entirely different historical reality emerged from the inscriptions themselves. One filled with detailed, boastful royal accounts of military conquest, captured enemy kings, and calculated political alliance building that revealed the sophisticated, often ruthless statecraft underlying the rivalry between powers like Tikal and Calakmul. The marriage alliance strategy Calakmul employed so effectively against Tikal deserves particular attention as a genuinely sophisticated instrument of ancient statecraft, one that modern political scientists, studying historical patterns of indirect influence and proxy conflict, would likely find genuinely familiar in its underlying logic. By strategically marrying Calakmul princesses into the ruling families of smaller cities positioned along Tikal's borders, the Snake Kingdom's rulers created durable, personal dynastic connections that bound these smaller states' own royal succession and political legitimacy directly to continued loyalty toward Calakmul, a far more subtle and sustainable form of imperial control than outright military conquest and occupation would have required, allowing Calakmul to project influence across a considerably wider territory than its own direct military resources alone could have realistically maintained through force. The eventual archaeological and epigraphic rediscovery of Calakmul itself deserves particular mention, since this once dominant rival to Tikal remained largely unexcavated and poorly understood by modern scholarship for far longer than its historical significance would suggest was warranted. Located in a considerably more remote section of the Yucatan Peninsula, compared to more accessible and thoroughly studied sites like Tikal, systematic archaeological investigation of Calakmul only began in earnest during the latter decades of the 20th century, gradually revealing the site's own massive scale, including one of the largest pyramid structures anywhere in the Maya world, and confirming through detailed epigraphic analysis of recovered inscriptions exactly how genuinely formidable and historically significant this Snake Kingdom capital had actually been during its own extended period of regional dominance. The 2018 LiDAR revelations fundamentally overturned decades of scholarly assumptions about how isolated and disconnected individual Maya cities actually were from one another. Rather than existing as scattered, largely independent settlements separated by unbroken wilderness, the Guatemalan jungle turns out to have once contained an extensive network of interconnected infrastructure, linking major population centers together across considerable distances. Central to this network were the Sacbiob, or white roads, elevated causeways constructed from crushed limestone and coated with a bright white plaster finish, engineered with remarkable precision to run perfectly straight and level across otherwise uneven, densely forested terrain, connecting one city directly to another in a manner that facilitated both trade and rapid military movement across the broader Maya lowlands. Water management posed a particularly severe challenge for Maya engineers, since much of their core territory lacked any significant rivers or lakes to rely upon for a stable water supply. In response, Maya cities constructed enormous artificial reservoirs capable of storing sufficient water to sustain dense urban populations through the region's pronounced dry seasons, alongside sophisticated filtration systems using layers of sand and volcanic minerals including zeolite to purify drinking water for their inhabitants. Filtration technology that would not be independently developed and understood using comparable scientific principles in Europe until many centuries later. Agricultural innovation proved equally sophisticated, with Maya farmers developing chinampas, a system of raised, highly fertile planting beds constructed directly within swampy or low-lying wetland areas, transforming otherwise unproductive terrain into some of the most agriculturally productive land available anywhere within their broader territory. Through this combination of sophisticated water management, agricultural innovation, and efficient transportation infrastructure, Maya civilization managed to sustain population densities in certain core regions that some modern estimates suggest may have rivaled or even exceeded population densities found in pre-industrial Europe. An extraordinary achievement, given the fundamentally challenging tropical environment in which this entire civilizational project unfolded. Yet this remarkable engineering success came bundled with a hidden long-term cost. The enormous quantities of limestone plaster required for pyramid construction, road building, and general urban infrastructure demanded the burning of staggering amounts of wood fuel, driving a steady, cumulative process of deforestation across the Maya lowlands that would, centuries later, prove to be one of several critical factors contributing directly to the civilization's eventual and dramatic environmental unraveling. The full scope of the 2018 LiDAR survey results deserves particular emphasis, since the technology fundamentally transformed scholarly understanding of Maya civilization's sheer physical scale almost overnight. Traditional ground-based archaeological survey, conducted by researchers physically hacking through dense jungle vegetation on foot, could realistically map only a tiny fraction of the total Maya landscape across an entire career of dedicated fieldwork. LiDAR technology, by contrast, allowed researchers to essentially strip away the forest canopy digitally, revealing thousands of square kilometers of previously undocumented structures, agricultural terracing, and defensive fortifications within a matter of weeks rather than decades. This single technological breakthrough effectively rewrote textbook estimates of Maya population density and urban complexity almost overnight, suggesting that the civilization's true scale of environmental modification and resource consumption had been substantially underestimated by earlier generations of scholars working without access to this transformative aerial mapping technology. The Chinampas agricultural system deserves further elaboration given its genuine ingenuity as a solution to the fundamental challenge of farming in wetland environments unsuitable for conventional cultivation. Maya farmers constructed these raised beds by layering alternating deposits of nutrient-rich mud dredged from surrounding waterways with organic plant material, creating highly fertile planting surfaces elevated above the surrounding water table, with the surrounding canals themselves serving double duty as both irrigation channels and convenient transportation routes for moving harvested crops directly to nearby markets by canoe. This same basic agricultural technique, independently developed by Maya farmers centuries before European contact, would later be observed by Spanish colonizers being employed on a considerably larger scale by Aztec farmers around Lake Texcoco, demonstrating a broader Mesoamerican pattern of sophisticated wetland agricultural adaptation that emerged independently in multiple distinct civilizational contexts across the region. Among the most genuinely chilling discoveries to emerge from decades of Maya hieroglyphic decipherment is what scholars now call the Star War phenomenon, a distinct and highly ritualized category of warfare that Maya rulers deliberately timed to coincide with specific, carefully calculated appearances of the planet Venus in the night sky. Venus held special and specifically ominous significance within Maya cosmology, closely associated with a deity connected to warfare and destructive violence, known in various inscriptions as Chak-Ek, or the Great Star, meaning that when Venus reached particular calculated positions in its observed astronomical cycle, Maya rulers interpreted this celestial alignment as a direct cosmic signal authorizing, and in certain religious contexts even demanding, aggressive military action against rival kingdoms. These Star War conflicts differed fundamentally in character from the more common, comparatively limited raids conducted to capture prisoners for ritual sacrifice or tribute extraction that characterized much of ordinary Maya intercity conflict. Star Wars instead aimed at nothing less than the total systematic destruction of an enemy capital, burning temples, smashing royal monuments bearing the defeated dynasty's carved likeness and genealogy, and specifically targeting the elimination of the losing city's entire royal bloodline, an act of political annihilation intended to permanently erase the defeated dynasty's claim to legitimate rule. In 562 AD, Calakmul deployed exactly this devastating strategy against its longtime rival Tikal, timing a massive, coordinated assault to align with the appropriate astronomical positioning of Venus. The resulting defeat plunged Tikal into what archaeologists now describe as a hiatus period, lasting approximately 130 years, a prolonged era during which the once dominant city ceased major monument construction entirely, a silence in the archaeological and inscriptional record that speaks volumes about the sheer scale of the military and political catastrophe Tikal had just suffered. Tikal's dramatic resurgence finally arrived in 695 AD under the leadership of King Jasor Chan Karweel, who successfully led his long-humbled city to a decisive military victory over Calakmul, definitively reversing more than a century of accumulated humiliation and re-establishing Tikal's position as the preeminent power within the broader Maya political landscape. Yet this extended cycle of warfare, however dramatic and militarily decisive in individual battles, exacted a steadily mounting cumulative toll on the broader Maya world. Sustained military expenditure, recurring cycles of destruction and reconstruction, and the persistent diversion of agricultural and labor resources toward warfare rather than infrastructure or food production all began quietly destabilizing the underlying economic foundations that had allowed Maya civilization to flourish so spectacularly in the first place. The specific astronomical calculations underlying the Star War timing system reveal an extraordinary level of scientific sophistication combined with genuine religious conviction on the part of Maya ruling elites. Maya astronomers tracked the synodic cycle of Venus, its appearance and disappearance from the night sky as an evening and morning star, with a precision that modern researchers studying surviving astronomical tables have found to be accurate to within a matter of hours across calculations spanning centuries into the future. This was not simply rough seasonal observation, but genuinely sophisticated predictive astronomy, deployed not for purely scientific curiosity, but as the literal, practical scheduling mechanism determining exactly when Maya armies would march to destroy their rivals. A striking illustration of how thoroughly Maya civilization fused what modern observers might separate into distinct categories of science, religion, and statecraft into a single, unified system of belief and practical governance. Tikal's eventual resurgence under Jasor Chan Kawil carried significance extending well beyond simple military revenge against Calakmul. The victorious king commissioned an ambitious building program celebrating this dramatic reversal of fortune, including the construction of his own funerary temple, Temple 1, one of Tikal's most iconic and instantly recognizable structures today, its steep pyramid form rising dramatically above the surrounding jungle canopy. The temple's inscriptions and associated artwork explicitly celebrate the defeat of Calakmul, ensuring that this pivotal moment of Tikal's restored greatness would be permanently commemorated in stone for future generations, a lasting monument to exactly the kind of dynastic vindication that Maya rulers considered among their most important possible legacies to leave behind for posterity. Amid this broader landscape of recurring warfare, certain Maya cities achieved extraordinary heights of artistic and architectural accomplishment that continue to astonish scholars and visitors today. Chief among these was Palenque, ruled for nearly 7 decades by the legendary king Pakal the Great, whose remarkably long reign allowed for sustained architectural investment, producing some of the most refined and aesthetically celebrated structures anywhere in the Maya world. Pakal's own funerary temple and elaborately carved sarcophagus lid have generated enduring popular fascination and controversy, with the intricate carved imagery depicting the king surrounded by cosmic symbolism that some later fringe theorists controversially and inaccurately interpreted as depicting an ancient astronaut piloting a spacecraft, an interpretation professional archaeologists have thoroughly and repeatedly debunked, identifying the actual imagery as a conventional, if artistically masterful, Maya depiction of the king's symbolic descent into the underworld, according to traditional Maya cosmological beliefs. Further south, the city of Copan earned a reputation among later scholars as something like the Paris of the Maya world, celebrated for its extraordinarily refined artistic tradition and its vivid, almost sculptural, 3-dimensional stone carvings, representing some of the most technically accomplished sculptural work produced anywhere across the entire Maya civilization's long history. Yet even this celebrated artistic capital proved vulnerable to the broader political instability increasingly gripping the Maya world. In 738 AD, Copan's ruler, a king known to history by the nickname 18 Rabbit, suffered a shocking and historically significant fate, captured and ritually beheaded not by some distant rival empire, but by Quirigua, a smaller city that had previously existed as Copan's own political subordinate. This single stunning event carried enormous symbolic weight far beyond its immediate military consequences, demonstrating unmistakably that even the most powerful and celebrated Maya kings could no longer guarantee their own personal safety, let alone the continued political stability of their broader kingdoms. In the years that followed, lesser nobles and regional officials throughout the Maya world increasingly began asserting greater independent authority of their own, contributing to a mounting, corrosive pattern of political fragmentation that would only accelerate in the coming decades. Pakal's own funerary temple, known today as the Temple of the Inscriptions, remains one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the entire history of Maya studies. When Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruiz Huillier discovered the hidden staircase leading down into Pakal's burial chamber in 1952, It represented the first time researchers had ever found an intact royal tomb sealed deep within a Maya pyramid, comparable in its own regional significance to the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in Egyptian archaeology decades earlier. The elaborately carved sarcophagus lid, the sheer quantity and quality of jade funerary offerings, and the meticulous hieroglyphic inscriptions documenting Pakal's extraordinarily long reign together provided archaeologists with an unprecedented wealth of detailed information about classic period Maya royal ideology, funerary practice, and dynastic record-keeping that continues to inform scholarly understanding of Maya civilization to this day. Copan's celebrated sculptural tradition similarly deserves closer examination, given its genuine distinctiveness within the broader landscape of Maya artistic achievement. Where many other Maya cities favored relatively flat relief carving for their monuments and stelae, Copan's artisans developed a remarkably three-dimensional, almost fully sculptural carving style, creating figures and hieroglyphic texts that project dramatically outward from their stone backgrounds in a manner requiring exceptional technical skill and an intimate understanding of the volcanic tuff stone locally available to Copan's sculptors, a material considerably softer and more workable than the harder limestone used in many other regions of the Maya world, allowing for this city's particular artistic tradition to develop its own genuinely unique aesthetic signature within the broader shared visual language of classic period Maya art. The Quirigua rebellion against Copan carries additional historical significance when examined within the broader context of trade route control and regional economic competition. Quirigua's strategic location along an important river trade corridor connecting the Maya highlands to Caribbean coastal trade networks meant that this smaller city's successful rebellion against its former overlord carried genuine economic as well as political consequences, potentially granting the newly independent city considerably greater control over valuable trade goods, including jade and other prestige items, that had previously flowed primarily through Copan's own commercial networks under the now deposed and executed King 18 Rabbit's centralized authority. Between the 8th and 9th centuries, archaeologists observe a genuinely striking and historically significant pattern emerging across Maya city after Maya city. The gradual cessation of stele construction, the large, elaborately carved stone monuments that Maya rulers had traditionally erected to commemorate significant royal accomplishments, historical dates, and dynastic genealogies. In city after city across the southern lowlands, the dates carved into these final monuments grow progressively later and later, and then, with striking abruptness, simply stop altogether. An eerie epigraphic silence that historians now recognize as one of the clearest archaeological signatures of the broader civilizational crisis already well underway by this point. Excavations at the city of Dos Pilas reveal particularly dramatic and unmistakable physical evidence of this unfolding catastrophe. Archaeologists discovered that the city's own inhabitants, in a desperate final act, tore down sections of their own magnificent temples and palace structures, repurposing the carved stone blocks to hastily construct defensive walls, a clear sign of a population under such severe and immediate existential threat that preserving their own sacred architecture had become a secondary concern compared to basic physical survival. Archaeological surveys around numerous abandoned Maya centers have similarly uncovered thousands of discarded spear points and other weapons scattered outside city walls, physical evidence consistent with sustained sieges and violent, sometimes total, population displacement, rather than any single decisive battle or catastrophic event. City after major city across the southern lowlands was abandoned during this period, their populations scattering into smaller, more dispersed settlements, or fleeing entirely into the surrounding forest, a slow-motion demographic collapse unfolding across multiple generations rather than through any single sudden catastrophic event. Who exactly was responsible for these attacks remains a subject of genuine ongoing scholarly debate, though the emerging consensus increasingly points toward endemic civil warfare and violent conflict between neighboring cities, likely intensified and accelerated by increasingly desperate competition for shrinking food supplies as broader environmental and agricultural conditions across the region began deteriorating. The specific pattern of monument abandonment across different Maya cities also reveals important variation that helps researchers understand the collapse's actual mechanics in greater detail. Rather than occurring simultaneously across the entire Maya lowlands in some single, unified, catastrophic event, the cessation of monument construction and eventual city abandonment unfolded as a rolling wave moving across the region over the better part of a full century, with certain cities collapsing considerably earlier than others, located sometimes only a relatively short distance away. This staggered, geographically uneven pattern of collapse suggests that local political, environmental, and military circumstances specific to each individual city-state played a genuinely significant role in determining the precise timing and severity of each community's particular experience of the broader regional crisis, rather than the collapse representing some single, uniform catastrophic event striking the entire Maya world with identical force and timing everywhere at once. The site of Dos Pilas offers particularly compelling and well-documented evidence of this desperate final period, since archaeologists have been able to reconstruct the site's final years in unusually fine-grained chronological detail. Excavation reveals not merely hastily constructed defensive walls built from repurposed temple stone, but also evidence that the city's final ruler was ultimately killed and possibly ritually sacrificed by attacking forces. His own elaborately carved monuments later found deliberately smashed and defaced by the conquering enemy in an act of calculated symbolic destruction, obliterating the defeated dynasty's claimed divine legitimacy in the same thorough, deliberate manner that Star War conflicts had once targeted rival royal lineages during the height of the classic period power struggles between Tikal and Calakmul generations earlier. The broader pattern of internal Maya warfare during this collapse period also reveals important evidence of shifting alliance structures under conditions of extreme resource scarcity. Rather than maintaining the more stable, generations-long rivalries that had characterized earlier classic period conflicts, like the extended Tikal-Calakmul struggle, inscriptions and archaeological evidence from this later crisis period suggest increasingly fluid, rapidly shifting alliances between neighboring cities, with former allies turning against one another within remarkably short periods as available agricultural resources continued shrinking and the basic calculus of political survival grew correspondingly more desperate and unpredictable across the entire fracturing Maya lowland political landscape. While warfare and political fragmentation clearly played devastating roles in the unfolding Maya collapse, modern scientific research has uncovered an even more fundamental underlying culprit hiding beneath the surface of these more visible historical events. Analysis of geological sediment cores extracted from lake beds throughout the Maya region, combined with detailed study of mineral deposits found within regional cave formations, has allowed climate scientists to reconstruct historical rainfall patterns across the Maya heartland with remarkable precision. What these studies revealed proved genuinely alarming. The Maya lowlands experienced what researchers now describe as the most severe sustained drought conditions the region had encountered in roughly 2,000 years, a climate catastrophe unfolding at precisely the moment Maya civilization was already straining under the accumulated pressures of endemic warfare and increasingly overtaxed agricultural systems. This mega-drought did not arrive as a single sustained event, but rather struck in a series of severe, recurring episodes, with particularly devastating drought conditions documented around the decades of the 810s, 860s, and 910s, a punishing, repeated pattern that gave Maya agricultural and political systems little meaningful opportunity to recover fully before the next severe drought cycle struck. Compounding this already severe natural climate stress, human environmental impact appears to have made underlying conditions measurably worse. The extensive deforestation required to fuel construction across centuries of pyramid and temple building had already begun altering local microclimate conditions, reducing regional rainfall, and increasing surface temperatures in ways that scientific models suggest genuinely intensified and prolonged the severity of these already devastating natural drought cycles. The religious and political consequences of this unfolding climate catastrophe proved just as significant as its purely agricultural impact. Maya kings had built much of their claimed divine authority and legitimacy on the assertion that they possessed genuine spiritual power to communicate directly with rain gods and ensure adequate seasonal rainfall for their people's crops. As reservoirs ran dry and harvests failed catastrophically year after year, this foundational claim to sacred royal authority collapsed alongside the physical infrastructure and food supplies these rulers had always promised to protect and provide. Populations increasingly lost faith in leadership that could no longer deliver on its most basic, foundational promise of ensuring survival itself, and this collapse of religious and political legitimacy directly fueled a growing wave of popular uprisings across the region, with numerous documented instances of angry populations violently overthrowing their own traditional royal rulers in the desperate, faltering final years of what had once been history's most sophisticated civilization anywhere in the Americas. The specific scientific methodology behind these climate reconstructions deserves genuine appreciation for its remarkable precision, given that researchers are effectively reconstructing rainfall patterns from more than 1,000 years in the past. By analyzing the ratio of different oxygen isotopes preserved within stalagmite formations inside regional caves, layer by microscopic layer, scientists can reconstruct year by year, and in some cases even season by season, variations in ancient rainfall with a level of chronological precision that would have seemed entirely impossible to researchers working even just a few decades earlier. This same isotopic analysis technique, combined with detailed study of sediment layers extracted from lake beds throughout the region, has allowed climate scientists to build an increasingly detailed and confident picture of exactly how severe, how sustained, and how geographically widespread this ancient mega-drought actually was across the broader Maya heartland. The specific relationship between drought severity and the geographic pattern of urban abandonment reveals genuinely important nuance that pure climate determinism alone cannot fully explain. Certain Maya cities situated near more reliable water sources, including locations closer to rivers or with access to particularly deep and dependable cenotes, appear to have weathered the broader regional drought crisis considerably better than cities more heavily dependent on artificial reservoir systems that could run catastrophically dry during the most severe portions of the extended drought cycle. This geographic variation in vulnerability helps explain why the collapse struck certain regions with such devastating, near-total severity, while other areas, even within a relatively similar broader climate zone, managed to sustain smaller but genuinely continuous populations throughout this same difficult period, ultimately contributing to the northward migration patterns that would eventually give rise to successor cities like Chichen Itza. As catastrophic food shortages spread relentlessly across the region, the fundamental character of Maya warfare itself transformed in ways that historians consider genuinely significant. Where earlier conflicts had frequently centered on capturing high-status prisoners for ritual sacrifice, or securing tribute payments and prestigious trade goods, warfare during this final crisis period increasingly became something far more desperate and immediate. Armed conflict fought purely for basic survival, as neighboring cities and communities competed violently over increasingly scarce remaining agricultural land and dwindling food reserves. Farmers throughout the region, facing failed harvests and mounting insecurity, increasingly abandoned their traditional agricultural fields altogether, either conscripted into hastily assembled defensive militias or fleeing entirely as desperate refugees, seeking safety and sustenance wherever it might still be found, across an increasingly chaotic and dangerous landscape. The extensive trade networks that had once efficiently connected Maya cities across the region allowing for crucial redistribution of food surpluses and essential goods during localized shortages, increasingly broke down entirely under the combined pressure of ongoing warfare and general societal breakdown, further intensifying the already severe crisis facing individual communities, left largely isolated and unable to draw on wider regional support networks. Widespread malnutrition inevitably bred disease and severe health crises throughout the affected population. Skeletal analysis conducted by modern archaeologists examining burial sites from this critical period has revealed clear physical evidence of severe anemia and other serious nutritional deficiencies, specifically among children. Physical proof embedded directly within human remains, confirming the genuine severity of the famine conditions gripping Maya society during these final catastrophic decades. By approximately 900 AD, the scale of the resulting societal collapse had become almost total. More than 90% of cities throughout the southern Maya lowlands, the very heartland that had produced civilization's greatest architectural and cultural achievements across the preceding centuries, had been completely abandoned by their populations. The encroaching jungle steadily reclaimed these once magnificent urban centers, burying temples and palaces beneath centuries of accumulated vegetation and soil, transforming humanity's most sophisticated tropical civilization into a genuine historical mystery that would remain largely unexplored and unexplained for many centuries to come. Yet, critically, and contrary to popular myth, the Maya people themselves had not vanished or gone extinct. Their civilization was transforming, not disappearing entirely. The demographic scale of this collapse deserves genuine appreciation, given just how significant it actually was in absolute human terms. Modern population estimates, informed substantially by the more recent LiDAR-based revisions to earlier population figures, suggest that the southern lowlands may have lost the overwhelming majority of an original population that had once numbered in the many millions, representing a demographic catastrophe of a scale that few other documented historical collapses anywhere in the world can genuinely match, in terms of both speed and total magnitude. Comparative historians studying societal collapse across different civilizations and different historical periods frequently cite the classic Maya collapse as one of the most extreme and best documented case studies available for understanding exactly how quickly a sophisticated, populous civilization can unravel when multiple compounding crises strike simultaneously rather than sequentially, overwhelming whatever adaptive capacity the underlying political and economic systems might otherwise have possessed to weather any single crisis occurring in isolation. The bioarchaeological evidence documenting this final crisis period offers a genuinely visceral, deeply human window into the lived reality of societal collapse that purely political or environmental analysis alone cannot fully capture. Beyond the anemia and malnutrition markers found in children's skeletal remains, researchers have also documented increased evidence of violent trauma across burial populations from this period, along with declining average human stature across successive generations. Physical evidence directly reflecting chronic nutritional stress, compounding steadily across an entire population over multiple decades of sustained crisis. These physical remains, studied by modern bioarchaeologists using increasingly sophisticated analytical techniques, transform what might otherwise remain an abstract historical narrative about political and climatic collapse into a genuinely concrete, deeply affecting record of individual human suffering experienced by real families living through the actual, lived reality of this civilization's final catastrophic unraveling. Survivors of the catastrophic southern lowland collapse increasingly migrated northward into the Yucatan Peninsula, a region offering a critical environmental advantage the drought-ravaged southern lowlands had lacked. Natural underground water sources called cenotes, providing crucial access to reliable fresh water even during periods of severely reduced rainfall. From this northern migration and resettlement emerged a genuinely remarkable new center of Maya civilization, the city of Chichen Itza, which rose to unprecedented prominence and influence beginning around the 10th century, representing a striking cultural and political renaissance following the catastrophic southern collapse. Chichen Itza's distinctive architecture, characterized by what scholars term the Puuc style, reflected a genuine cultural fusion between traditional Maya building traditions and influences brought by new arrivals connected to the Toltec civilization of central Mexico, producing a visually striking hybrid artistic and architectural tradition unlike anything that had previously developed within the more geographically isolated southern lowland cities. The city's most celebrated structure, the massive step pyramid known as El Castillo, incorporated an extraordinary feat of astronomical and architectural engineering. During the precise moments of the spring and autumn equinoxes, the pyramid's own shadow creates a striking visual illusion of a giant serpent slithering down its northern staircase, a deliberately engineered demonstration of sophisticated astronomical knowledge combined with genuine architectural artistry. Politically, Chichen Itza and its northern successor states embraced a notably different governmental structure compared to the rigid, single-ruler divine kingship that had characterized the classic southern lowland cities. Rather than concentrating absolute authority in one supreme ruler, northern Maya cities increasingly adopted a system called multipal, a form of collective governance distributing authority among a council of powerful noble families rather than resting on any single individual, an apparent, deliberate response to the catastrophic vulnerabilities that concentrated, purely personality-driven royal authority had so clearly demonstrated during the earlier southern collapse. The precise nature of Chichen Itza's connection to distant Toltec civilization remains a subject of considerable ongoing scholarly debate, with researchers divided over whether the striking architectural and artistic similarities between the two cultures reflect direct migration and conquest by Toltec warriors, a more gradual process of cultural exchange and trade influence, or some combination of both dynamics occurring simultaneously across different periods of the city's development. What remains beyond dispute is that Chichen Itza's rulers successfully synthesized these various cultural influences into something genuinely new and distinctive, creating an artistic and architectural tradition that, while clearly drawing on both Maya and Central Mexican precedents, ultimately represented its own unique civilizational achievement rather than a simple imitation of either source tradition alone, reflecting the same kind of creative adaptability that had allowed Maya civilization to survive and reinvent itself across so many previous centuries of dramatic historical transformation. The sacred cenote at Chichen Itza itself deserves particular attention as one of the most archaeologically significant sites within the entire Maya world, a massive natural sinkhole that served as a major pilgrimage destination where offerings, including gold, jade, and, according to substantial archaeological evidence, human sacrificial victims, were cast into its waters as part of ongoing religious ritual throughout the city's period of greatest influence. Underwater archaeological expeditions conducted throughout the 20th and 21st centuries have recovered thousands of artifacts from the cenote's depths, along with human remains confirming these ancient ritual practices, providing researchers with an extraordinary, remarkably well-preserved archaeological record of religious offering practices that might otherwise have remained purely speculative based on written and pictorial sources alone. Edward Herbert Thompson, an American consul and amateur archaeologist working in the early 20th century, conducted some of the earliest systematic dredging expeditions of the sacred cenote, recovering thousands of artifacts that he controversially shipped back to institutions in the United States, a practice that later generations of archaeologists and Mexican cultural heritage authorities would come to view as a significant act of cultural extraction requiring eventual, though only partial, restitution. Subsequent, more methodologically rigorous underwater archaeological work conducted throughout the later 20th century employed proper diving equipment and modern excavation techniques, recovering additional artifacts and human remains while documenting their precise archaeological context in ways that Thompson's earlier, cruder dredging operations had entirely failed to preserve, providing considerably more reliable scientific data about the actual chronology and nature of these ancient ritual offering practices. This Northern Renaissance also witnessed the emergence of increasingly sophisticated maritime trade networks and a genuinely early form of commercial economic activity, with cacao beans serving as a widely recognized and standardized form of currency throughout much of the broader Maya trading world, facilitating extensive coastal trade connections stretching across a considerable portion of the wider Mesoamerican region. As Chichen Itza's own influence and political dominance gradually declined across subsequent generations, a new center of northern Maya power emerged during the 1200s, the fortified city of Mayapán, which rose to become the dominant political center governing much of the broader Yucatan Peninsula during this later period of Maya history. Mayapán governed through a formal political structure historians refer to as the League of Mayapán, a coordinated confederation exercising authority over numerous subordinate cities and communities scattered throughout the surrounding Yucatan region, representing one of the more genuinely centralized political arrangements to emerge anywhere within the broader post-collapse Maya world. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a society still living under the persistent, pervasive shadow of ongoing warfare and violence, with Mayapán itself surrounded by unusually thick and extensive defensive fortifications, physical infrastructure reflecting a genuine, deeply ingrained anxiety about continued military threats that had never fully faded from Maya political consciousness, even generations after the earlier Classic period collapse. Political tension within Mayapán increasingly centered on bitter rivalry between two powerful noble families. The Cocom lineage, which had come to dominate the city's central political authority, and the Shu lineage, an increasingly influential rival family that grew steadily more resentful of continued Cocom dominance over the broader regional confederation. This simmering rivalry finally erupted into open, violent rebellion in 1441 AD, when the Shu family led a successful uprising that violently overthrew Mayapán's ruling Cocom dynasty, effectively destroying the city's centralized political authority and triggering what historians now describe as a genuine second Maya collapse. Following Mayapán's violent fall, the broader Yucatan region fractured once again into 16 smaller, mutually competing and frequently warring provincial territories, none of them ever managing to re-establish anything resembling the broader regional political unity that Mayapán itself had, however imperfectly, once maintained. This was the fundamentally fractured, politically divided landscape that Spanish explorers would eventually encounter when European ships first began arriving along the Yucatan coastline in the following century. The archaeological remains of Mayapán itself, though considerably less architecturally refined and artistically celebrated compared to the great Classic period cities that preceded it, offer valuable insight into how Maya civilization continued adapting its political and urban organization even in this later, more turbulent historical period. Excavations reveal a densely packed urban center, with residential structures crowded closely together within the city's defensive walls, in a manner suggesting genuine, persistent anxiety about external security threats. A marked contrast to the more spacious, ceremonially oriented urban planning that had characterized earlier Classic period capitals like Tikal or Copan, where sprawling temple complexes and plazas had once dominated the urban landscape during periods of greater relative political stability and security. The eventual fragmentation of the League of Mayapán into 16 independent, mutually competing provinces established the specific political landscape that would directly determine how Spanish conquest of the Yucatan Peninsula would eventually unfold. Rather than confronting a single unified political authority whose defeat or capitulation might have effectively secured the entire region in one decisive campaign, incoming Spanish forces instead faced a genuinely fragmented patchwork of small, independent polities, each maintaining its own separate political leadership, military forces, and willingness or unwillingness to resist or accommodate the arriving European colonizers. This fundamental political fragmentation, itself a direct legacy of Mayapan's violent collapse decades before Spanish contact, would prove to be one of the single most important factors explaining why the eventual conquest of Maya territory required such a dramatically extended and difficult military campaign compared to the swifter Spanish conquest of the more centralized Aztec Empire further to the west. The Cocom and Shu family rivalry that ultimately triggered Mayapan's violent collapse also reveals important continuity with much older patterns of Maya elite competition stretching back through the entire Classic period and beyond. Just as rival dynasties at Tikal and Calakmul had once competed for regional supremacy through warfare, strategic marriage, and religious legitimacy centuries earlier, the Cocom and Shu families pursued remarkably similar strategies of political consolidation and rivalry, suggesting that certain fundamental patterns of Maya elite political competition persisted across enormous spans of time and dramatic transformation in the broader civilization's political geography, even as the specific cities, dynasties, and precise historical circumstances continued changing substantially from one century to the next. In 1511, a Spanish ship wrecked off the Yucatan coast, and among the small number of survivors who managed to reach shore were two soldiers, Jerónimo de Aguilar and Gonzalo Guerrero, whose subsequent fates diverged dramatically and would go on to illustrate, in genuinely striking fashion, two fundamentally different possible responses to first contact between these two vastly different civilizations. Aguilar eventually rejoined Spanish forces years later, serving as a valuable interpreter during subsequent Spanish expeditions into the region. Guerrero, by contrast, chose an entirely different path. He remained among the Maya, married into a prominent local noble family, adopted traditional facial and body tattoos in accordance with Maya custom, and eventually rose to become a trusted and respected military advisor, actively helping lead Maya forces in direct resistance against subsequent Spanish military incursions into the region. Between 1517 and 1519, official Spanish conquistador expeditions began arriving along the Yucatan coastline in earnest. Initial exploratory campaigns led by figures including Hernán Cortés himself, who would soon after turn his primary military attention toward the considerably wealthier and more centralized Aztec Empire further to the west. Perhaps the single most devastating weapon accompanying these Spanish expeditions was entirely invisible: smallpox, a disease against which indigenous American populations possessed no prior immunity whatsoever, arrived ahead of organized Spanish military forces and killed an estimated half of the entire Maya population through disease alone, inflicting catastrophic mortality before any organized, coordinated military resistance could even be mounted. The fundamental difference between the comparatively rapid Spanish conquest of the centralized Aztec Empire, completed within roughly 3 years, and the vastly more prolonged Spanish conquest of Maya territory reveals a great deal about the underlying political structure each civilization actually possessed. The Aztec Empire, organized around a single dominant capital and centralized imperial authority, essentially collapsed once that singular capital fell to Spanish forces. The Maya, by dramatic contrast, having never been unified under any comparable single central government, forced Spanish conquistadors into a grinding, city-by-city, kingdom-by-kingdom military campaign that would ultimately stretch on for more than 170 years. Maya military forces increasingly adopted effective guerrilla warfare tactics well suited to their dense forest environment, including concealed pit traps, ambush tactics, and strategic withdrawal deep into the jungle interior, conditions that inflicted severe and sustained hardship on heavily armored Spanish soldiers operating within brutally hot, humid tropical terrain for which their traditional European military equipment and tactics had never been designed. Gonzalo Guerrero's remarkable story deserves particular attention as one of history's more striking examples of genuine cultural conversion during this era of first contact between European and indigenous American civilizations. Rather than representing some brief or superficial accommodation, Surviving accounts describe Guerrero as having fully integrated into Maya society, reportedly refusing later Spanish offers to rejoin colonial forces despite considerable inducement, and ultimately dying in battle, fighting alongside Maya warriors against Spanish forces during a subsequent military campaign. His story stands in genuinely stark contrast to the far more common historical pattern of European conquistadors imposing their own culture, religion, and political authority onto indigenous populations, offering a rare, well-documented example of the reverse process occurring instead. However atypical this particular individual case ultimately proved to be within the much broader and more devastating pattern of the overall Spanish conquest. The catastrophic demographic impact of introduced European diseases extended well beyond the initial smallpox epidemic that struck ahead of formal Spanish military contact. Successive waves of additional diseases, including measles and various other infections against which indigenous American populations possessed no prior immunity whatsoever, continued sweeping through Maya territory across subsequent decades, compounding the already severe population losses caused by warfare, forced labor, and social disruption associated with ongoing Spanish colonization efforts. Modern historical demographers estimate that the combined effect of these repeated disease epidemics, occurring across multiple successive waves throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, may have ultimately reduced the total indigenous population of Mesoamerica by somewhere between 80 and 90% compared to pre-contact levels, representing one of the most catastrophic demographic collapses documented anywhere in recorded human history. As Spanish forces gradually established firmer control across most of the broader Yucatan Peninsula over subsequent decades, one significant group of Maya, known as the Itza, made a fateful decision. Rather than submit to Spanish authority, they retreated deep into the dense, largely inaccessible interior jungle of the region, now recognized as Guatemala. There, the Itza established their new capital, Nojpetén, strategically built upon an island situated in the middle of Lake Petén, Itza, a location offering genuinely formidable natural defensive advantages against any conventional Spanish land-based military assault. From this remote and well-protected stronghold, the Itza Maya successfully preserved their political independence, traditional religious practices, and cultural autonomy, including continued ritual human sacrifice, for well over a full century following the broader Spanish conquest of surrounding territories, an extraordinary, sustained act of indigenous resistance, representing the last genuinely independent political and cultural holdout anywhere on the entire American continent. Spanish missionaries periodically attempted to establish peaceful religious contact with the Itza during this extended period, seeking to introduce Christianity and negotiate eventual political submission. But these missionary efforts frequently ended in the missionaries' own execution at the hands of Maya religious and political authorities determined to preserve their traditional way of life against continued outside interference. The final ruler of this remarkably persistent kingdom, King Can Ek, maintained genuine confidence in the protective power of traditional Maya prophecy and calendar-based religious belief, reportedly convinced that Maya sacred calendrical prophecy indicated the appointed time for his kingdom's submission to Spanish authority had simply not yet arrived, a deeply held religious conviction that shaped his political decision-making right up until the kingdom's final, catastrophic military confrontation with Spanish forces. In 1697, Spanish military commander Martín de Ursúa finally launched a decisive, carefully prepared military campaign against this last independent Maya stronghold, constructing a heavily armed galley vessel specifically equipped with cannons at the edge of the lake, explicitly designed to finally breach Nojpetén's formidable natural island defenses after more than a century of continued, frustrated Spanish efforts to bring this last independent Maya kingdom under full colonial control. The century of continued Itza independence at Nojpetén represents a genuinely remarkable historical anomaly worth appreciating in its full context. While Spanish colonial authority had already firmly established itself across virtually the entire remainder of Mesoamerica and much of South America by this point, extracting resources, converting populations, and administering vast colonial territories for well over 100 years, this single remote kingdom continued operating according to entirely traditional Maya political and religious principles, conducting diplomacy on its own terms, and periodically executing Spanish missionaries who ventured too far into their territory without adequate military escort. This extended survival was made possible not merely by the settlement's formidable natural island defenses, but by its sheer geographic remoteness. Situated deep within terrain that Spanish colonial administrators generally regarded as offering insufficient economic incentive to justify the substantial military investment that a full conquest campaign would inevitably require. King Canek's religious convictions regarding the timing of his kingdom's eventual submission drew directly from the sophisticated Maya calendrical prophecy tradition, which held that history unfolded according to recurring cycles governed by the completion of specific calendar rounds, with particular dates carrying significant prophetic weight regarding major political transitions and transformations. Surviving accounts suggest Canek genuinely believed, based on his own culture's traditional calendrical calculations, that a specific approaching date held particular significance for his kingdom's eventual political fate, a conviction that shaped his diplomatic engagement with visiting Spanish emissaries and may have influenced his own strategic calculations regarding exactly when and how his kingdom's inevitable confrontation with Spanish colonial power would ultimately unfold. The broader historical significance of Nojpetén's eventual fall extends well beyond its symbolic status as the final independent indigenous kingdom in the Americas. Modern historians studying the extended century-long standoff between Spanish colonial authority and this remote Maya holdout increasingly recognize it as offering genuinely valuable insight into the practical limits of European colonial power during this era, demonstrating that even a relatively small and materially modest indigenous kingdom, if positioned with sufficient natural defensive advantages and sufficient geographic remoteness from centers of colonial economic interest, could successfully resist and delay full European conquest for a period extending across multiple entire generations, a far more prolonged and genuinely contested process than the simplified popular narrative of swift, essentially uncontested European conquest across the Americas typically suggests. On March 13, 1697, Spanish cannon fire finally shattered the defensive perimeter that had protected Nojpetén for more than 100 years, launching the decisive final assault against the last independent Maya political center anywhere in the Americas. Thousands of Maya warriors, facing an overwhelming and clearly decisive military defeat, desperately leapt into the surrounding lake in a final attempt to escape the advancing Spanish forces, only to be shot as they attempted to swim to safety, staining the lake's waters with blood, in scenes later Spanish chroniclers themselves described as a devastating, almost overwhelming massacre. King Canek himself was captured alive during this final assault, and Spanish forces proceeded to systematically destroy every religious idol and sacred object they discovered throughout the conquered city, a deliberate, comprehensive act of cultural erasure accompanying the kingdom's final military defeat. This single catastrophic event marked the definitive, final end of independent Maya political and military authority anywhere in the Americas, extinguishing the very last sovereign indigenous state to survive the broader European conquest of the continent, nearly 2 full centuries after Spanish forces had first arrived along Mesoamerican shores. Modern archaeological consensus has thoroughly and repeatedly confirmed one crucial point beyond any reasonable scholarly doubt. The Maya never disappeared or went mysteriously extinct, despite generations of sensationalized popular mythology suggesting otherwise, including entirely baseless claims involving alien abduction or similarly fantastical explanations for their civilization's dramatic historical transformations. The genuine, evidence-based explanation for Maya civilization's dramatic historical arc instead points toward a devastating convergence of multiple compounding factors occurring together. Severe recurring drought, extensive self-inflicted environmental degradation through unsustainable deforestation, escalating and increasingly desperate warfare, and the chronic absence of any lasting centralized political unity capable of coordinating an effective, unified response to these mounting, interconnected crises. There is a genuinely sobering lesson embedded within this long historical arc for contemporary audiences. Even history's most sophisticated, technologically advanced, and intellectually accomplished civilizations remain fundamentally vulnerable to collapse when they exhaust or degrade the underlying ecological systems that sustain them. Following the final conquest, Spanish colonial authorities, most notoriously a friar named Diego de Landa, ordered the systematic mass burning of Maya written texts, known as codices, an act of deliberate cultural destruction that permanently erased centuries of accumulated Maya historical, scientific, and religious knowledge. Today, only 4 of these original Maya codices are known to have survived anywhere in the world, a devastating, irreplaceable loss of accumulated human knowledge and historical memory. The subsequent colonial period brought sustained subjugation and forced labor for surviving Maya populations, though indigenous resistance never entirely disappeared. In the 19th century, Maya communities in the Yucatan launched a sustained, prolonged armed uprising remembered as the Caste War, a renewed and genuinely significant attempt to reclaim indigenous political autonomy and self-determination generations after the original Spanish conquest had seemingly settled the region's political fate. The great classic cities themselves, including Tikal, Copan, and Palenque, remained largely reclaimed by encroaching jungle for centuries, only beginning to be systematically rediscovered and scientifically excavated by archaeologists during the 19th and 20th centuries, with continued LiDAR-based discoveries even today suggesting that our broader understanding of Maya civilization's true scale and sophistication remains very much an incomplete and actively evolving picture. Perhaps most importantly of all, the Maya people themselves remain very much alive today. More than 6 million Maya descendants currently live throughout Mexico and Guatemala, continuing to speak Maya languages and maintaining traditional beliefs that persist alongside, and often genuinely blended with, Christian religious practice introduced during the colonial period. Living, breathing evidence of extraordinary cultural resilience and continuity extending across more than 2 millennia of dramatic historical transformation. The Maya story is, at its core, a story about resilience rather than pure and total disappearance. Collapse, this remarkable civilization's long history repeatedly demonstrates, does not have to mean complete and final annihilation. Standing today before the towering pyramids of Tikal, surrounded by the distant calls of howler monkeys echoing through dense surrounding jungle, one encounters a powerful and enduring reminder. No matter how impressive or seemingly permanent human achievement and power may appear in any given moment, nature ultimately, and inevitably, reclaims what was always, in the end, only ever borrowed.